For my 60th birthday, my only son, Mark, sent me a bottle of whiskey. It was an expensive bottle, the kind you save for a special occasion, nestled in a silk-lined box that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. A single malt, aged 18 years, with a name I could barely pronounce but recognized from the glossy magazine's Chloe, my daughter-in-law, always left scattered around their sterile, white-on-white living room. I held the heavy, dark glass bottle in my hands, tracing the embossed label with a callous finger, and felt a familiar pang. It was a mixture of pride and a subtle, nagging sense of distance. Pride that my son, my boy who I taught to ride a bike and bait a fishing hook, could now afford such casual luxuries. But the distance was there, too, a cold space that had been growing between us for years, ever since he'd married into the monolithic wealth of Chloe's family. The card, tucked into the box, was a testament to that distance. It was signed in Chloe's perfect, soulless calligraphy. "Happy birthday, Dad. Hope you enjoy this. Love, Mark." And Chloe. Mark's name was there, but his hand wasn't. He hadn't even signed it himself. Still, I told myself, it was the thought that counted. A busy man, my son. An important man. I placed the bottle on my mantelpiece, a dark sentinel amongst the framed photos of a younger, smiling Mark, of my late wife, Helen, and of my grandson, Leo, the one true and uncomplicated joy in my life. The very next day, I had my monthly obligatory dinner at Mark and Chloe's. These dinners were always an exercise in quiet endurance. I'd sit on their brutally uncomfortable Italian leather sofa, while Chloe's father, David, a man who oozed the smug satisfaction of inherited wealth, held court. David was the patriarch of their clan, and his presence filled every room he entered, sucking the very air from it. He spoke in pronouncements, not conversations, and his favorite topic was himself, his business acumen, his golf handicap, his impeccable taste in everything from wine to architecture. That evening, he was pontificating about a new extension he was building on his already cavernous mansion, a climate-controlled wine cellar that would house his collection. I listened, nodded, and kept my opinions like my hands to myself. As I was leaving, a thought struck me. An impulse, born of a lifetime of trying to build bridges, of trying to find common ground with this family my son had chosen. I remember the whiskey. On my way home, I detoured, my old pickup truck feeling distinctly out of place as I pulled up the long, winding driveway to David's estate. He answered the door himself, a look of mild surprise on his face, as if he couldn't quite place who I was for a moment. "Arthur," he finally said, his tone flat, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" I held up the gift bag containing the silk-lined box. "Just wanted to drop this off," I said, forcing a smile. "A little housewarming gift for the new wine cellar. Or, well, whiskey cellar." In this case, David took the bag, his eyebrows raising a fraction as he peered inside. He pulled out the bottle, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Well now," he said, his voice dripping with a condescending sort of amusement. "This is quite the gesture, Arthur. To what do we owe this sudden largesse?" I felt a flush of irritation at his tone, but I pushed it down. "Mark and Chloe gave it to me for my birthday," I explained. "It's a bit too rich for my blood. I figured you'd appreciate it more than I would." He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to seem friendly, but felt more like a dismissal. "A wise decision. It will be wasted on your palate." "Thank you, Arthur." Very thoughtful. I drove home that night with a sour taste in my mouth, feeling foolish and small. I didn't know it then, but that single act of misguided generosity, that attempt to bridge an unbridgeable gap, would be the first thread I would pull, the one that would ultimately unravel the entire rotten tapestry of their lives, and my son's complicity in it. The whole incident was a masterclass in the subtle art of humiliation, something David had perfected over decades of dealing with people he considered his inferiors, a category in which I was firmly placed. But the true betrayal, the one that would shift the tectonic plates of my world, was still weeks away, lying in wait like a coiled snake. It arrived, as betrayals often do, in the innocent voice of a child. It was a Saturday, my day with Leo. He was 10, a bright, inquisitive boy with my late wife's eyes and an unfortunate amount of his mother's nervous energy. He was my anchor, the reason I tolerated the sterile dinners and David's insufferable monologues. We were in my workshop, a place of comforting chaos filled with the smell of sawdust and old oil, a stark contrast to the minimalist mausoleum his parents called home. I was showing him how to build a small birdhouse, guiding his small hands as he hammered a nail. He was chattering away, as he always did, about school, about a video game he was playing, and then, out of nowhere, he said it. Grandpa David thought it was really funny. I paused, the hammer in my hand hovering over a nail. Funny? What was funny, buddy? The whiskey, he said, his focus entirely on the crooked nail he was trying to straighten. He was telling Grandma Sarah about it at dinner last week. He said, "Can you believe he gave it back to me?" He had no idea it was my bottle to begin with. He said, "You look so proud, like a dog with a bone." The hammer slipped from my grasp and clattered onto the concrete floor. The sound echoed in the sudden, deafening silence of the workshop. Gave it back to me. My bottle to begin with. The words repeated in my mind, each one a small, sharp stone pelting the carefully constructed image I had of my son. It couldn't be. Mark wouldn't do that. He wouldn't take a gift from his father-in-law, a man he knew I disliked, and pass it off as his own. It was a mistake. Leo must have misheard. Children get things muddled. But Leo was a smart kid with a memory like a steel trap. And the cruelty of the description, like a dog with a bone, had the undeniable ring of David's voice. I took a deep breath, forcing my hands to stop shaking. "Leo," I said, my voice strained. "Are you sure that's what Grandpa David said?" He looked up at me then, his brow furrowed with concern. "Yeah, why? Was it a secret?" "A secret. That was one word for it. A sordid, pathetic little secret that spoke volumes. It wasn't about the gift itself. It was about the utter, staggering lack of thought, of respect. It was the casual, dismissive deceit. The fact that my own son couldn't be bothered to spend 5 minutes picking out a gift for his father's 60th birthday. Instead, he'd simply grabbed a hand-me-down from his rich father-in-law, wrapped it up, and passed off the sentiment as his own. And worse, so much worse, was the mockery that followed. They had laughed about it. David, Chloe, and perhaps even Mark himself had sat around their dinner table, laughing at the old man, so easily fooled, so touchingly grateful for their second-hand offering. The humiliation washed over me in a hot, sickening wave. I felt my face burn, the same way it had burned standing on David's doorstep. For the rest of the afternoon, I went through the motions. I helped Leo finish the birdhouse, my movements stiff and robotic. I praised his work, my voice sounding hollow and distant to my own ears. When Mark arrived to pick him up, I could barely look at him. I saw him now through a different lens. Every smile seemed like a smirk, every word of concern a carefully crafted lie. "Everything okay, Dad?" he asked, his hand on my shoulder, the same shoulder David had clapped in mock camaraderie. I flinched. "Just tired," I mumbled. "Long week." He accepted it without question, too wrapped up in his own world to notice the earthquake that had just shattered mine. As he and Leo drove away, I walked back into my silent house, the birdhouse clutched in my hand. I went to the mantelpiece and looked at the pictures. Helen, my beautiful Helen. What would she think of the man our son had become? What would she think of the fool I had been? That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my old armchair, the house dark around me, and I let the anger burn. It was a cold, clean anger, a clarifying fire that burned away years of self-deception, of polite fictions and tolerated slights. I had allowed this to happen. I had stood by silently while my son was absorbed into this alien family, while he adopted their values, their casual cruelty, their worship of money above all else. I had mistaken his success for happiness, his ambition for character. The whiskey wasn't an oversight. It was a symptom of a much deeper disease. It was a symbol of his utter capitulation to David's world, a world where genuine sentiment was a currency to be counterfeited, where acts of love and respect were just transactions to be optimized for maximum convenience. I knew then, sitting in the dark, that I couldn't let it go. This wasn't just about a bottle of whiskey anymore. It was about my son's soul. It was about my own self-respect. And it was about the truth. I needed to know the full extent of the rot. I had to understand how deep the deception went. And so, the plan began to form. It was a quiet thing at first, a seed of an idea planted in the fertile ground of my rage. I was a retired structural engineer. My entire life had been about details, about seeing the hidden flaws in a foundation, about understanding how pressure, applied in just the right place, could bring the whole edifice crumbling down. I would be patient. I would be methodical. I would wear the mask of the doddering, slightly out-of-touch old man they all believed me to be. I would smile and nod at their dinner parties. I would feign ignorance. And all the while I would watch. I would listen. I would gather my evidence. They had mistaken my quiet nature for weakness, my patience for senility. They had underestimated me. It would be the last mistake they ever made. My first step was deceptively simple. I needed confirmation, irrefutable proof that the bottle was David's. My mind, trained for precision and detail, latched onto a memory. When I had held the bottle, admiring it on the mantelpiece, I had noticed a tiny, almost invisible scratch on the glass near the bottom, a unique flaw. And there was something else, a detail from the box itself. The silk lining had a small, faint watermark in the corner, shaped vaguely like a leaf. The next week, I called Chloe, my voice full of feigned warmth. "Chloe, my dear, I was just thinking. That whiskey you and Mark gave me was so wonderful. I'd love to get a bottle for an old friend from work who's retiring. Could you possibly tell me where you bought it? I can't seem to find it in the local shops." There was a brief pause on the line. "Oh," she said, her voice a little flustered. "You know, Mark handled that." "I'm not sure. I'll ask him and get back to you." Of course she would. I knew she'd never call back, and she didn't. The lie was already beginning to protect itself. But her hesitation was confirmation enough. If they had bought it themselves, she would have known where. The next step was riskier. I needed to see the bottle again. I engineered a visit to David's house, using Leo as my excuse. I told Chloe I wanted to drop off the birdhouse Leo and I had built, so he could see it mounted in his other grandparents' sprawling garden. She agreed, albeit with a tone that suggested it was a monumental inconvenience. When I arrived, David was predictably in his study. I could hear his booming voice on a conference call. I told his wife, Sarah, a woman so thoroughly cowed by her husband she was practically transparent, that I needed to use the restroom. Instead of going to the guest powder room, I made my way towards David's study, a room I knew housed a large built-in bar. The door was slightly ajar. I peered through the crack, and there it was, sitting on the polished mahogany bar, not in a place of honor, but clustered with several other half-empty bottles of liquor, was the whiskey. From my vantage point, I couldn't see the scratch, but my heart hammered in my chest. He treated it with the same casual disdain he treated everything else. A gift from his son-in-law's father, relegated to the common stock. While he was distracted on his call, I slipped into the room. My hands were steady, my mind ice-cold. I walked to the bar, my eyes scanning the room, my ears straining for any sound of movement. I picked up the bottle. I tilted it towards the light from the window. And there it was, the tiny, star-shaped scratch near the base. My breath caught in my throat. It was the one. I had my proof. But just as I was about to put it down, my eyes fell on a stack of receipts on the edge of the desk, held down by a crystal paperweight. One was from a high-end liquor emporium in the city, dated 2 days before my birthday. My heart pounded. I carefully lifted the paperweight, my fingers nimble from decades of working with small, precise components. I scanned the itemized list, and there it was, nestled between a case of French wine and some ridiculously priced cigars. Glenmorangie, 18-year-old, single malt Scotch whiskey. The price made me dizzy. It was more than my first car had cost. This was it, the smoking gun, the original purchase receipt. I pulled out my phone, my fingers flying across the screen as I snapped a quick, clear photo. I replaced the receipt, squared the paperweight exactly as it had been, and placed the bottle back on the bar. I was out of the room in less than a minute, my pulse thundering in my ears. I found Sarah in the kitchen and mumbled some excuse about feeling unwell, that I'd dropped the birdhouse off another time. I fled their house. The image of the receipt burned into my mind. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was a cold, hard, verifiable fact. The ride home was a blur. The anger I felt was so pure, so intense, it was almost paralyzing. It wasn't just that they had lied. It was the depth and casualness of the deception. They hadn't just re-gifted a bottle. David had bought it, given it to Mark to give to me, likely as a way to curry favor or fulfill an obligation with zero effort, and then they had all shared a laugh at my expense. I was a pawn in their little game of social chess, a piece to be moved and then discarded. But the game was about to change. I was no longer a pawn. I was the player on the other side of the board, and I was just beginning to plan my moves. They had shown me their hand. Now, I would show them mine. The whiskey was the key, the entry point into their web of deceit. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this was just the beginning. A man who could be so casually cruel to his own father for the sake of convenience and the approval of his wealthy father-in-law was capable of so much more. The rot, I suspected, went far deeper than a single bottle of scotch, and I was determined to dig it all up, no matter what it took. The mask was now firmly in place. Over the next few months, I became the very picture of the harmless, aging father. I attended the family dinners, smiling blandly as David pontificated and Chloe offered thinly veiled criticisms of my home, my clothes, my very existence. I'd listen to Mark talk about his high-pressure job at David's real estate development firm, nodding with what I hoped looked like paternal pride. I played my part to perfection. I'd occasionally ask about the whiskey, a wistful, slightly confused expression on my face. You know, I never did find that bottle you gave me. Must be a specialty item. Mark would wave a dismissive hand. Don't worry about it, Dad. It was just a little something, a little something. The words dripped with condescension, and I would feel the cold fire of my anger flare, but my face would remain serene. Every dismissive word, every patronizing glance was another piece of fuel on the fire, another reason to see this through to the end. My ally in this silent war was, ironically, the one person they all patronized almost as much as me, my grandson Leo. He was a digital native, a boy who could navigate the complexities of code and firewalls with an ease that baffled me. He saw the world in a way I didn't, and he also saw the fractures in his own family with a child's unfiltered clarity. He knew his mother was always stressed, his father always distracted, and his grandpa David was a bully. He didn't have the words for it, but he felt it. I began spending more time with him, not just in the workshop, but in my home office. I told him I needed help organizing my old files, digitizing my engineering blueprints for my career. It was a plausible excuse. My old brain can't keep up with all this new technology, I'd say with a self-deprecating chuckle. Leo, eager to help and show off his skills, dove in headfirst. Under the guise of this project, I began to teach myself, with his help, about the digital world they inhabited. I learned about cloud storage, encrypted emails, and social media footprints. Leo was a patient teacher, and I was a meticulous student. My true investigation began with Mark's finances. I had a plausible reason to be involved. Years ago, I had co-signed on his first business loan, a small contracting company he had started before he met Chloe. The company had since been absorbed into David's massive firm, but my name was still on some of the original corporate paperwork, a loose end they had never bothered to tie up. It was a foothold, a legitimate reason to request documents. I started with a simple, emailed request to Mark's office, CCNG his assistant, for the annual shareholder reports and financial statements for the subsidiary that had once been my son's company. Just doing some spring cleaning of my old financial records, I wrote, keeping the tone light and casual. The documents that came back were sanitized, full of corporate jargon and opaque figures. But an engineer knows how to read a blueprint, whether it's for a bridge or a balance sheet. I saw inconsistencies, numbers that didn't add up, transfers to holding companies with vague, anonymous names. It was a thread. I pulled on it. I used my standing as a co-signer to request more detailed records, citing my potential legal liability. The resistance was immediate. Mark called me, his voice tight with annoyance. Dad, what is this? It's all just boilerplate. You don't need to worry about any of it. Humor me, son, I said, my voice quavering slightly, playing the part of the confused old man. At my age, you worry about loose ends. I just want to make sure everything is in order, he sighed, a sound of pure exasperation. Fine. I'll have them send over the detailed ledgers. But honestly, you're wasting your time. He wasn't sending them to be transparent. He was sending them because he believed I was too old and too foolish to understand them. That was his first critical error. The ledgers were a maze of numbers, but I spent weeks poring over them, cross-referencing dates and figures, creating my own spreadsheets on my old desktop computer. And then I found it. A series of large, regular payments, listed as consulting fees, being made to a company I'd never heard of. Northgate Holdings, LLC. The payments were substantial, totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past 2 years. There was no corresponding record of any work performed by this Northgate Holdings. It was a ghost, a phantom entity receiving a river of cash. I needed to know who was behind it. This is where Leo's skills became indispensable. I told him I was trying to track down an old colleague who I thought had started a company called Northgate. I gave him the name, and he went to work. Within an hour, he had navigated the labyrinth of public records and corporate registration databases. Northgate Holdings, LLC was a shell corporation. Its registered agent was a law firm known for specializing in offshore accounts and asset protection for the ultra-wealthy. But the incorporating documents, the ones filed with the state, listed a single director. My heart hammered against my ribs as Leo read the name aloud from his laptop screen. It was David. Of course it was David. My son's company, the one I had helped him start with my own savings and a belief in his integrity, was being used as a slush fund to funnel money directly into his father-in-law's pocket. They were bleeding the company dry, and I was willing to bet that Mark was complicit. But complicity wasn't enough. I needed proof that Mark knew, that he was an active participant, not just a clueless puppet. The proof, I suspected, would be in their digital communications. This was the most dangerous part of my plan. I needed access to their emails, their text messages. It felt like a monumental betrayal of privacy, but then I remembered the laughter, the dot with a bone comment, the casual, cruel dismissal of my love. They had forfeited any right to privacy when they decided to treat me as a fool. My opportunity came during a family barbecue at Mark and Chloe's house. It was a typically tense affair. David was holding court by the grill, Mark was hovering by his side like a loyal courtier, and Chloe was flitting about, micromanaging everything. I had brought my laptop with me, under the pretense of showing Leo some old family photos I had digitized. While the adults were distracted by cocktails and conversations, I guided Leo over to the Wi-Fi network. "Leo," I said, keeping my voice low and calm. "I seem to have forgotten the password to my email account. Is there a way to recover it? And while you're at it, could you show me how Mark's new cloud storage system works?" He said he backed up all our family photos there. It was a lie, of course, but a plausible one. Leo, always happy to demonstrate his technical prowess, nodded eagerly. He sat at Mark's sleek, minimalist desk, his small fingers flying across the keyboard. Mark, like so many people who felt secure in their own intelligence, had sloppy digital habits. His passwords were saved in his browser. His cloud account was perpetually logged in. It was a digital fortress with the gate left wide open. Within minutes, Leo had navigated to the family photo archive. But with a few quiet instructions from me, he also installed a piece of software on Mark's computer. A keylogger. A simple, undetectable program that would record every keystroke and send a report to a secure email address I had created for this very purpose. It was a gross violation, and a wave of guilt washed over me. But it was quickly replaced by a cold resolve. I was not a thief in the night. I was an auditor, examining the books of a corrupt enterprise. That night, the first report came in. It was a jumble of data, website logins, search queries, and fragments of messages. It took me hours to sift through, my eyes burning from the screen's glare. And then I found it. An email chain between Mark and David. The subject line was simply, Northgate. My hands trembled as I read. The emails were damning, a step-by-step chronicle of their fraud. They discussed disguising the payments, falsifying invoices, and moving the money offshore. They talked about managing the auditors and keeping the old man's legacy, my son's original company, on paper while stripping it of its actual value. But the most sickening part was their tone. They were arrogant, cavalier, and utterly without remorse. They made jokes. They congratulated each other on their cleverness. And in one email, David wrote something that would be seared in my memory forever. Don't worry about your father. He's too sentimental to see the numbers and too old to understand them if he did. He's a relic. Useful for a signature, but that's about it, a relic. Useful for signature. My own son had replied with a single, chilling word. Agreed. I felt a profound, bottomless cold spread through my chest. This was a different kind of pain than the one I felt about the whiskey. That was a betrayal of love. This was a betrayal of my entire life's work, of the very foundation of trust upon which a family is built. They saw me as an obstacle, a tool to be used and discarded. I saved the emails, encrypting them in a separate file. I took screenshots. I created a dossier, a meticulous record of their crimes, complete with the liquor store receipt, the corporate filing for Northgate Holdings, the falsified ledgers, and now, their own words damning them from beyond the screen. For months, I continued to gather evidence. The keylogger provided a steady stream of information. I learned of their plans to dissolve the subsidiary entirely, leaving nothing but an empty shell once they had extracted the last of its value. I learned that they were using the siphon money to fund a lavish new development project, one that was set to be announced at a major industry gala. The gala was in honor of David. He was receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award for his contributions to the city's development. It was the perfect stage, a public celebration of a man's legacy, his real legacy. I now had everything I needed. The blueprints of their destruction were complete. All that was left was to choose the time and the place to detonate the charges. The night of the gala was a symphony of self-congratulation. The ballroom of the city's most expensive hotel was filled with the powerful and the influential, a sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. The air was thick with the cloying scent of expensive perfume and the sound of false laughter. I was there, of course. I had been invited as a courtesy, a token family member, to fill a seat at the main table. I was the relic, the quaint old father, a living prop in the grand theater of David's success. I wore my best suit, an old one that Helen had bought me for our 25th anniversary. It was hopelessly out of fashion, a fact that Chloe had pointed out with a pitying smile when I arrived. "Oh, Arthur," she'd said, "how vintage." I had just smiled back a gentle, harmless smile. The mask was so comfortable now, it felt like a second skin. Throughout the dinner, I watched them. David was in his element, magnanimous and charming, accepting congratulations with a practiced humility that was utterly fraudulent. Mark stood by his side, a pale imitation of his father-in-law, his face flushed with a mixture of pride and adoration. He looked at David with a hero worship that he had never, not once in his entire life, shown to me. He caught my eye once across the table and gave me a quick, dismissive nod, as if to say, "See, this is what real success looks like." He had no idea. He was a lamb, fattened for the slaughter, blissfully unaware of the butcher's knife being sharpened just out of sight. The master of ceremonies, a slick local news anchor, began the presentation. A syrupy tribute video played on the large screens flanking the stage, filled with fawning interviews from business partners and politicians, all praising David's vision, his integrity, his philanthropy. My stomach turned. I had prepared my own presentation. A few days prior, I had contacted the event's audiovisual team. I told them I was the proud father-in-law and that I had prepared a surprise tribute for David, a short slideshow of family photos to be played after the main video. I played the part of the sentimental old man perfectly, my voice thick with emotion as I described the precious memories I wanted to share. They were only too happy to oblige, giving me instructions on how to upload my file to their system. My file wasn't a slideshow of family photos. It was a meticulously crafted PowerPoint presentation. The first slide was a simple, high-resolution photo of the whiskey bottle, the Glenmorangie 18. The second was a crystal-clear image of the liquor store receipt, with the date and the item circled in red. The subsequent slides contained the corporate registration for Northgate Holdings, David's name clearly visible as the sole director. Then came the bank statements, with the consulting fees highlighted. And finally, the emails. Screenshots of the entire conversation between Mark and David, their callous words writ large for all to see. Underneath the final email, the one where my son agreed I was a relic, I had typed a single, simple question in a large, bold font. Is this integrity? I had also embedded audio files. I had used a simple voice recorder app on my phone during several family dinners, capturing David bragging about his clever accounting and Mark laughing along. It was all there, a complete, irrefutable chronicle of their greed and their contempt. As the official tribute video ended to a round of thunderous applause, David, beaming, made his way to the stage. He accepted the heavy crystal award, holding it aloft like a trophy. He tapped the microphone, the sound echoing through the silent, expectant ballroom. "Thank you," he began, his voice thick with false emotion. "I am truly humbled. I've always believed that success is not just about what you build, but how you build it. It's about integrity. It's about family." This was my cue. I subtly caught the eye of the AV technician at the back of the room, a young man I had spoken to earlier. I gave him the prearranged signal, a simple, almost imperceptible nod. He nodded back and typed a command into his laptop. David continued, "I owe so much of this to my family, to my wonderful wife, Sarah, and of course to my daughter Chloe and my son-in-law, Mark, who has become the son I never had." He never finished a sentence. Because at that exact moment, the two massive screens on either side of him, which should have shown a smiling picture of his face, flickered. And then, the image of the whiskey bottle appeared, stark and accusatory in the dim light of the ballroom. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. David stopped, his smile faltering as he glanced at the screens. He looked confused, annoyed. Then the slide changed. The receipt, the date, the price. The murmuring grew louder. People were leaning forward in their seats, pointing at the screens. David's face began to drain of color. Mark, at the front table, shot to his feet, his face a mask of horrified confusion. He looked from the screens to me. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. In that moment, he knew. He saw the quiet, harmless old man disappear, replaced by the architect of his ruin. The slides kept changing, a slow, methodical rhythm, like a steady drumbeat of doom. Northgate Holdings, the bank statements, and then the emails. The words were so large, so clear, that people in the back of the room could read them easily. A collective gasp went through the audience as the first email appeared. The room, which moments before had been filled with adulation, was now thick with a tense, shocked silence. The only sound was David's ragged breathing into the live microphone. Then came the audio, my recordings. David's voice, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system, boomed through the ballroom. Not the smooth, charming voice of his speech, but his true voice, arrogant and cruel, bragging about his financial schemes. "The beauty of it is its simplicity," his recorded voice sneered. "We bill for services never rendered, and the money just vanishes into the ether. By the time the auditors even notice, it'll be in a bank in the Cayman Islands." And then Mark's voice, laughing. A hollow, sycophantic laugh. The final slide appeared. The email where I was dismissed as a relic, and beneath it, my question, "Is this integrity?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, filled with the weight of 1,000 judgments. David stood on the stage, frozen, his face the color of ash. The crystal award slipped from his numb fingers and shattered on the floor. Mark had collapsed back into his chair, his head in his hands, his body shaking with silent sobs. Chloe was staring at the screens, her perfect makeup unable to hide the look of utter devastation on her face. I stood up. I didn't shout. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke calmly, my words carrying in the dead silence. "For my 60th birthday," I said, my voice clear and steady, "my son and his father-in-law conspired to give me a second-hand bottle of whiskey. They thought it was a great joke." I looked directly at David, then at Mark. "You see, they believe that some people are just relics. Useful for a signature, perhaps, but ultimately disposable. They believe that integrity is just a word to be used in speeches, not a principle to live by. They believe that no one is watching. They are wrong. I let the words hang in the air for a moment. Then I turned, and without a backward glance, I walked out of the ballroom. I didn't need to see the fallout. I had designed the demolition with precision. I knew the structure would collapse exactly as planned. The aftermath was swift and brutal, a corporate and social extinction level event. The gala, intended to be David's crowning achievement, became the scene of his public execution. The story was irresistible to the media. A titan of industry, exposed as a fraud at his own tribute dinner by the father of the man he called his son. It was on every local news channel, in every newspaper. The phrases Northgate Holdings and Relic became infamous. The business consequences were catastrophic. David's company, built on a carefully crafted reputation of trust and integrity, imploded. Investors pulled out. Business partners severed ties. The board of directors forced him to resign in disgrace. The development project, the one being funded by my son's stolen legacy, was dead, buried under an avalanche of scandal and legal investigations. The district attorney's office launched a formal investigation into fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. Last I heard, both David and Mark were facing the very real possibility of prison time. Their personal lives were equally decimated. The scandal shattered the perfect facade of their family. Sarah, David's wife, who had lived her life in a shadow, finally found her voice and filed for divorce. Chloe, humiliated beyond measure, left Mark. Their marriage, it turned out, was as hollow as the companies they ran, a merger of ambition and money, with no real foundation of love or respect to sustain it through a storm. She took Leo and moved in with her mother, refusing to speak to either her father or her estranged husband. Mark lost everything: his job, his wife, his son, his reputation, and his father-in-law's favor, which he had prized above all else. He was a pariah. He tried to call me, of course. Dozens of times. He left rambling, desperate voicemails, a pathetic cocktail of apologies, accusations, and self-pity. He blamed David. He blamed Chloe. He blamed the pressure he was under. He never once took full responsibility for his own choices. He never once seemed to understand the fundamental nature of his betrayal. It was never about the money. It was about the respect. I never answered his calls. I never replied to his texts. There was nothing left to say. My relationship with my son was a casualty of the war he had started, a structure so rotted from the inside that it had to be condemned. Sometimes I feel a pang of sadness for the boy he once was, the son I loved. But that boy is long gone, replaced by a man I no longer know, a stranger who looked at his own father and saw nothing more than a relic. My life, on the other hand, has found a new, quiet peace. The anger is gone, replaced by a sense of calm, of justice served. The world is a little bit more balanced than it was before. My relationship with Leo is my salvation. With Mark and Chloe out of the picture, he spends most of his weekends with me. We work in the garage, we go fishing, we talk. I'm trying to teach him what it means to be a man of integrity, not by giving speeches, but by living it. I am trying to build a foundation for him that is strong and true, one that won't crumble under pressure. I sold my house, the one filled with too many ghosts, and bought a smaller place with a bigger workshop. I am designing and building custom furniture, a passion I had set aside for decades. My hands, which once drafted blueprints for massive structures, now shape wood into things of beauty and utility. It's good, honest work. It feels real. I have found that true wealth isn't measured in stock portfolios or square footage, but in self-respect. They try to take that from me. They thought they could diminish me, render me invisible. But they failed to understand a fundamental principle of engineering. The oldest foundations, the ones built with care and integrity, are often the strongest. They can bear more weight than anyone imagines. I was not a relic to be discarded. I was the foundation upon which my son had built his life. And when he and his mentor chose to desecrate that foundation, they brought the entire, glittering, hollow structure crashing down upon their own heads. I feel no joy in their destruction, only a grim, quiet satisfaction, a sense of peace. The world is right again. For those of you listening, Perhaps you faced a moment where you were underestimated, where your kindness was mistaken for weakness. I hope my story serves as a reminder that it is never too late to demand respect, to stand up for your own worth. The quietest people often have the most to say, and the most patient among us can bring about the most profound change. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe for more tales of justice, and share your own story in the comments below. I read every one.